Welcome to Global Health, ahs400. Today we're covering Chapter 12, Nutrition and Global Health. Now the first thing you have to understand about this is what nutrition is. Nutrition is the consumption, the eating and processing of foods to allow the body to survive, grow, adapt and be healthy. Okay? Everyone's nutrition is the same, but the fundamental basis is that everyone needs the same types of building blocks of nutrition to stay alive and stay healthy. The key parts of this nutrition would be carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and of course water. Now, unfortunately, throughout the world, the global economy is very different. And the lowest income communities tend to have too little food, or food that's of poor and insufficient caloric value, or lack of nutritional supplementation, i.e. it's not producing enough protein, not providing enough essential carbohydrates, nutrients for the body to thrive and survive. Quite often, developing countries go through transitions. They have burdens of nutritional problems, of people being overnutritioned, and then areas of people have undernutrition. Now we tend to see the undernutrition problems occurring more in lower income families, especially with families with children. The cost of eating or getting food is, in some cases, so expensive that the only types of food they can get are the lowest quality and the poorest types of food. Okay? High to middle income communities tend to be overnutrition as countries develop, and by that we mean they become obese. And this brings on with it a myriad of different diseases. Hypertension, diabetes are the most prevalent ones that we see. Now the next thing we're going to cover is macronutrients. These would be your carbohydrates, proteins, oils, fats. These are what we consume on a regular basis in large quantities, basically for energy, so our body can utilize those protein building blocks, amino acids, to repair itself and keep us moving and keep us active, keep us healthy. Now the basic unit of nutrition that we talk about is calories. Okay? 1 calorie is the amount of energy it takes for food energy to be broken down and release energy. Okay? Now when we eat food, we're not counting it in calories, we're counting it in kilocalories. So the average person, for example, in the United States is on 2,000 calories a day. That would be 2,000 kilocalories. Now, if you look at the back of a nutrient label, on the back of a can of food, a can of peas, a can of something, it'll have the food requirement as big C calories. Big C calories means it's kilo. If the calories has a little c in front of it, that means it's not thousands, it's just per calorie. Okay? So 1,000 big C calories, 100 big C calories is 100,000 calories. Okay? So when we talk about 2,000 calories, it's 2,000 big C calories, which is the same as 2,000 calories, which is 2 million. Yay! Okay. Now the number of calories that we consume on a daily basis is variable on the size of the person and the demands. If you move more and you're more active, you need more calories than someone who's sedentary, who moves less. The key thing to remember though is that regardless of body size and motion, we need a minimum number of calories to survive. And that minimum number for most individuals is around 1,200 calories per day. The more you move, the more you need. Okay? Now one of the ways we can determine the number of calories we need on a daily basis is by looking at our height, our weight, and then making an equation based upon those. That equation will be posted in Blackboard for you to download so you can determine the number of calories that you need. Another way we can figure that out is by your weight, timesing it by 15. So if you weigh 150 pounds or 100 pounds, times it by 15, that means you need 1,500 calories a day to sustain that weight. Okay? That's not the most exact measurement because it's just using your weight right now, but it gives you a rough idea. Okay? Now the different types of food substances that we require on a daily basis include carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are basically sugars. Okay? We also need fiber. Now fiber is non-digestible. The reason we need fiber is to clean out our intestines. Okay? It makes everything nice and clean and healthy, so the nutrients that we require on a daily basis are absorbed more easily. Okay. Now approximately about 50% of your caloric intake in a day should come from carbohydrates. The more active you are, the more you need. The less active, the less you need. So the average is about 50%. Less active people take about 40 to 45. More active people need about 65% or more depending on the activity. Now, when we look at our diets across the world, we tend to find that low-income countries tend to eat diets that are more starchy. And then these diets tend to exceed the recommended daily proportion of requirements on a daily basis. Starches tend to be complex carbohydrates. It takes longer to break those carbohydrates down into sugar. Okay? An example of a starchy food would be potatoes. Okay? It takes the body longer to break those down into carbohydrates, which we're using for energy. Okay? Now, the next type of food substance that we require on a daily basis is proteins. Now, proteins are broken down into amino acids by the body, and these amino acids contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and nitrogen, as opposed to a carbohydrate which is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So the proteins are required by the body to repair itself. Okay? We can use proteins for energy when we're breaking it down, but again, the key fundamental principle of proteins is to help rebuild and repair. Now, there are different amino acids. Okay? Some of these amino acids, about 20 of them, are considered to be essential amino acids, which means we need them on a daily basis from our foods to stay healthy. If we don't get these essential amino acids, our bodies start to break down, and then you're more likely to get sick and contract diseases. Meat substances are a great form of protein because they're broken down readily into amino acids. We can also get amino acids from plant-based amino acids, proteins, which are soy, for example. The problem with plant-based is you need a lot more plant-based amino acids or proteins to match the same protein amino acid requirement that you can from a meat source. Now, the meat proteins are also variable. The softer the meat, the less protein it has. For example, a steak has more protein than would, say, a piece of fish. The difference between the two is it's easier to get the proteins and amino acids out of fish than it is out of steak. Okay? So the denser it is, the more protein it has, but the harder it is to liberate those proteins. Okay? Now, these proteins can then be broken down into another two subsets. These are complete proteins. These are ones that contain all the essential amino acids you require on a daily basis. And then the complementary proteins. These provide portions or combinations or some of those amino acids that are required on a daily basis. About 20 to 35% of your daily diet should be protein based. Okay? The next thing we have is fat. Now, fat is essential to help repair the body because we're using it for energy. We're also using small amounts of fat to help provide protection on your body. Okay? Now, these fats are then broken down into lipids, oils, and fats themselves. Now, lipids are fatty acids. These are hydrocarbon chains with chemical groups at the ends of each chain. The other type we have is oils. Oils are lipid plant in origin. The most common and better of the oils that we eat on a daily basis is olive oil, though current literature says that corn oil or canola oil is better for you than olive oil. Now, olive oil can then be broken down into regular olive oil, which is fairly inexpensive. Then we have the virgin olive oil, which is purified, which they've taken some of the imperfections or substances out of it. Then extra virgin, which is double filtered or triple filtered. The more expensive the olive oil, the more filtered it's become. Okay? Then, of course, we have fats. Now, fats typically come from animal sources, not plants. So we tend to see it in substances like butter. And if we take it from, say, pigs or anything like that, we can use it as lard. Okay? Butter is healthier for you than lard. Lard has a higher fat proportion and it's harder for the body to remove, even though it may taste better. Okay? Now, if you look at the three substances or the food substances we've had, fats, carbohydrates and proteins. Carbohydrates and proteins release 4 kilocalories per gram, whereas fats tend to release 9. So we can get more energy from fats. The problem is if we don't use that energy, we tend to store more of those fats, and that creates a situation of obesity. Of your daily diet, approximately 1/3 or up to 1/3 of your diet on a daily basis should be fat-based. Okay? Now, when we look at the world, we tend to see that countries that have a higher gross deficit, okay, or have a higher income, tend to have a fattier diet than countries that have a lower income. The reason being is we tend to have more fatty foods, fatty meats in countries with more money than countries that are poorer. Okay? Right. Now, fats themselves can then be broken down into unsaturated, saturated and trans fats. Now, trans fats are the ones that are usually liquid at room temperature, and they can be combined with other substances to make solid fats by adding hydrogen through infusion and pressurization. Now, these trans fats are then broken down into LDLs, which is low density lipoproteins, and HDLs, which is high density lipoproteins. Now the low density lipoproteins are the ones that are bad for you. They tend to become cholesterol and can cause hypertension, cardiovascular problems, cause blockage, obstruction and heart disease. Now a lot of people think that cholesterol, when we talk about it, is coming directly from fats. And that's true, we do get some of it, but we also get cholesterol produced in our body by our liver from sugars. So again, if we're trying to get lower cholesterol, we need to lower the fat intake, but also lower your sugar intake. Okay? In some instances, the sugar intake is more detrimental to your body for cholesterol than the fat intake. Okay? The next type of fat that we mentioned was saturated fats. These are usually saturated with hydrogen and have single bond carbon atoms. Then we have unsaturated. These contain at least one double bond in the hydrogen carbon chain, and they tend to protect against heart disease. So we want to make sure we're eating unsaturated fatty acids more so than anything else. Okay. Then last we have to have water. Now the bulk of your body is water based. 92% of your blood, for example, is water. All the chemicals, or most of the chemical reactions that are occurring in your body, happen in water. So you have to have water coming into your body on a regular basis. Now at rest, if you're not active, our body needs a minimum of 64 ounces of water per day just to stay healthy and stay alive. The more active you are, the more water you need. So for every mile of activity that you perform, you need an extra 8 ounces of water. Okay? One of the new rules or guidelines that came out a few months ago, last year, stated that you needed your body weight converted from pounds to ounces. For example, if you weigh 150 pounds, make that 150 ounces of water on a daily basis just to sustain what your body needs to survive and stay healthy. Okay? Now, a lot of times when we go through life, or in third world countries, we tend to have malnutrition. The problem with malnutrition is that the people are getting food or getting no food, and the foods that they're getting aren't providing enough energy. So for example, if you live in a country that's poor, high levels of poverty, and there's no food, our body starts to cannibalize itself and break itself down for energy. And unfortunately, it's breaking down our muscles, which are protein based effectively, into an energy source. And they start auto-digesting themselves just to get energy to survive. Now we tend to see malnutrition, another term for this would be undernutrition, in countries that are poorer. Okay? In a lot of third world countries, 1 in 5 deaths in children under 5 years old is attributed to undernutrition or malnutrition. Okay? One of the things that we're trying to do on a global basis is to end hunger, and we're trying to do so by providing funding to third world countries or countries of low incomes, or providing supplementation or subsidizing food to make it more affordable. Now hopefully we can have a situation where countries are able to sustain their own diets and grow foods and provide food nutrition to their populations. But unfortunately in a lot of third world countries, when they have a higher number of children per family as opposed to the US, they don't have enough income to provide nutrition for their foods. And in those countries you have a larger child population or larger population where they can't produce enough food for themselves. Now, one of the biggest things that we tend to see in undernutrition or third world based countries is the fact that these children tend to get diseases. Illnesses that are of no issue or no concern in the United States can be prevalent and cause death. One of the biggest things that we tend to see is death due to diarrhea. Okay? The body doesn't have enough electrolytes to sustain itself, so the child dies. And then acute respiratory infections. We tend to see those in other countries where the kids aren't getting enough green healthy vegetables to supplement and improve their cardiovascular, their respiratory system. They tend to have breathing difficulties and breathing problems, which lead to infections which will kill them. We also, as mentioned in a couple of the other PowerPoints, tend to see diseases like malaria tending to kill children or kill the population of countries as well because there's lack of protection. One of the things the United States did a few years ago was they had a couple of grants or foundations develop here where we were providing malaria curtains for children to put around their bedding. Because the mosquitoes that were tending to biting them more at night time than during the day as temperatures cooled. Now mosquitoes tend to get attracted to people not because of oxygen but because of carbon dioxide. So when you breathe out, the amount of carbon dioxide is higher around you, so mosquitoes are attracted to it, and then they recognize your body heat and they bite you. And in these third world countries, a lot of these bacteria, mosquitoes tend to have malaria, which will be picked up by the person, and unfortunately because of the lack of medications and lack of access to medications or the affordability of medications, these children get conditions where they die. Okay? Right. Now, one of the things that we talk about when we're looking at children is to making sure that they're healthy. And we do this with a science called anthropometry. Anthropometry is body measurements. From the time we're born in the US, people are measuring how long we are, how heavy we are, our head circumference, our body circumference, our limb lengths, to make sure that we're healthy. Now, unfortunately, in third world countries, this doesn't happen. Okay? So anytime that we measure your height, your weight, your body fat, your waist circumference, your percentage of body fat, your waist circumference, and other measurements, it's anthropometry. And we can use these tables by comparing you with you to see if you're developing properly and normally. And we tend to find that in third world countries you have a large population of people or children that are underweight. We have people that are stunted in growth, even though that their weight is coming, they can't grow and develop because there's lack of resources or building blocks for them to get taller and stronger. And then we see children that are wasting away. These are children with low weight for height ratios or weight for length ratios, and this again is because of malnutrition. And unfortunately, even when we start to provide nutrition for these kids, in a lot of instances it may be too late and they can't recover from it and develop normally. Okay? Now, one of the things that we try to talk about with global standards is global health and global development. What we're trying to do is make sure that children throughout the world, from birth up to 5 years of age, are given proper nutrition and proper guidelines. Now, the US is one of the countries that have helped the World Health Organization by providing healthcare, by providing medication, nutrition and food, and also providing training to people in those communities to measure children, to weigh children, and increase the quality of healthcare. In the United States, we're spoiled because we have doctors and nurses everywhere. In a lot of these third world countries, you go to a village, there may not be a nurse or a doctor for a 5 or 10 mile radius of all these villages. So a lot of times people have to walk because there's no transportation for several hours just to get to a doctor for someone to looking at them, or to look at their child or look at them. Okay? What we're trying to do now is develop these countries where they have a healthcare professional visiting these villages on a regular basis, or training people within these villages to make sure these people, or the people that live there, are healthy or have a minimum standard of life that's prone to help them develop and not be ill. Okay? Now, if we look at our PowerPoint chart figure 12-2, we have growth charts for weight and height for girls from birth to 5 years of age. And when we look at these charts, we want to make sure that these children are at least in the 50th percentile or up to the 85th percentile, in that range for growth and development. Now, a lot of these third world countries have charts developed for them for these third world countries, based upon the population of those countries. So they're more accurate in a lot of instances than the charts that we have in the US, because the charts that we use in the United States are based upon the average American. Now, unfortunately, there are no real averages in this country because we're a demographic that comes from all over the world. So when you compare someone from Mexico or India or Canada to, well, not necessarily Canada because it's very close here, to the United States charts, they may be lower in weight and height and development, but if you compare them to their national charts, where they come from, they'll be normal. Okay? So the charts are just used in the United States as a guideline. What we want us to do is make sure we're looking at those charts and we're seeing those kids are growing and moving up the line on their chart that they're at and meeting those benchmarks. So every 3 months or 6 months or every year when they go for their physicals, the kids are definitely progressing up the chart and reaching the next goal or diversity for their age. Okay? Now, severe acute malnutrition. Now, this is a child that has a very low weight for height score. This is usually because they're not getting enough food or they haven't received food for a prolonged period of time. Back in the 90s, early 2000s or late 80s, we tended to have a lot of severe acute malnutrition in third world countries. In particular, one of the countries that had this was Ethiopia, where a large percentage or proportion of the population died because of malnutrition. And regrettably, the largest percentage of people that died because of that were children, from birth up until I think it was 16 years of age. The reason the children were dying was that the babies were dying was their mothers weren't getting enough nutrition and couldn't breastfeed or provide enough nutrition for the mucus produced in breast milk to provide nutrition for the babies, so the babies pretty much starved to death. What we've tried to do since then is provide aid to these countries in times of famine or starvation, provide nutrition for them, and also provide supplementation for the babies in case mummy couldn't produce milk. Baby powder was provided with water so that milk products could be provided for these children so they could survive. Okay? Now there are some diseases that can occur with protein energy malnutrition. Okay? The first one that we've heard of commonly is Kwashiorkor's disease. This is when children have a very low protein diet and they develop edema, fluid retention within their body. Another one we have is marasmus, which is where children are born, children don't get enough protein and become emaciated, weak and lethargic. They can't move because their body's starting to auto-digest and break down. Okay. Right. Okay. Now, part of the treatment that we're trying to do is provide ready-to-use therapeutic food for these children, and this is RTUF foods. These are foods that are high in energy and high in protein, and have small amounts of fat, and they're good for these children. One of the best food substances that we have that's been developed is actually peanut-based. So peanut butter, if in a situation we're starving, provides protein, provides some carbohydrates and fat to allow the body to become healthy. So we tend to ship a lot of protein or peanut-based foods to these countries so that we can get nutrition and help these children become healthier. Okay. Next we have undernutrition epidemiology. Okay. Now, globally, there are about 125 to 150 million children under age of 5 that have stunted growth because of lack of nutrition available to these countries. We tend to see these countries in Africa, parts of Asia, parts of the Pacific Rim area, and unfortunately in Latin America. Part of that is because the amount of money that's provided or available for growing and planting and developing foods isn't there. So part of the World Health Organization plans is to make sure that food and nutrition is provided to these countries cheaper, or in some instances when the United States is involved, at no cost, and distributed to these people so they can get nutrition and survive. Okay? Right. Okay. Now, as we mentioned before, one of the biggest problems we have for undernutrition is poverty. If the country has no money or people don't have money, they can't afford to buy foods. We see a lot of that in third world countries. But we have the same problems occurring in low-income households or poverty-based households in the United States. It's easier to go out and buy food from McDonald's than it is to go buy from a grocery store and provide nutrition. An example I can give you is when my wife and I go grocery shopping, which we did earlier today, my wife spent about $50 that would cover dinner for today and tomorrow, so $25 a day. Okay. If I was to go to McDonald's and buy dinner for the children and the family, and there's 5 of us here, we could probably eat at McDonald's for less than $20, and usually less than $15 for everybody. So again, cost to ratio, food ratio, it's cheaper to buy unhealthy food than it is to buy healthier food. We need to bring those costs down in the United States and globally so that people can have better nutrition. Okay. If we look at chart figure 12-3, so I'm looking at my laptop here, it discusses nutritional status of children less than 5 years of age, and what we can see is that the mortality rates because of nutrition, we're seeing, hold on a second, that the stunting and underweight diversity over time has decreased from 1990 to 2015. Though it has reduced to only 10% of the population of these countries, it's come down dramatically from the 20 to 40% mark that it was at before. The goal of the World Health Organization is to make sure that number drops to below 5% and hopefully one day becomes eradicated. So there is no child on the planet dying of malnutrition. Okay? Unfortunately, acts of God, famines occur naturally. One of the good things that we've done now is we've streamlined it so that we can provide nutrition and aid to these countries relatively faster than we were able to before. In the 1980s, to provide nutrition in these countries could take anything from weeks to months. Now, we've streamlined it to anything from days to weeks. Okay? Right. If we look at the next chart, this is figure 12-4. We look at prevalence of stunting in children less than 5 years of age, 2005 to 2016. And we can see that, unfortunately, most of the malnutrition areas, again, are the third world countries. Africa, we tend to see a high number of that also. Parts of Asia are seeing that, and unfortunately we're seeing part of it in Latin America, South America, okay, Mexico, South America. We're trying to eradicate that and again improve those situations. Those numbers are coming down, but again it's taking a lot of effort. One of the biggest problems is a lot of these countries can't discuss or figure out problems with other countries. For example, the United States tries to get aid to a lot of these countries, but because of the geopolitical situation, aid isn't being accepted, or if aid is provided, a lot of the food that we're providing or nutrition or medicines that we are providing aren't going to the sources or the places they're required. One of the things that happened that we tend to see in the late 80s in Africa was that we were providing food to third world countries. The planes were landing, being unloaded and taking off again. Then other planes or other trucks were coming in, being loaded, and the food was being sold to other countries by the governments. Okay? What we try to do now is streamline it so that the food is being brought in and being distributed by the United Nations and the World Health Organization via Red Cross and other organizations to the people that actually need it. Okay? If we look at our next chart, which is figure 12-5, it's percentage of under children under 5, so this would be from birth to 60 months of age, who are more than 2 standard deviations from the median of the World Health Organization. From these charts, we tend to see that the developed countries, European, American countries, tend to have the lowest numbers, whereas the third world countries, India, Nigeria, Ethiopia per se, tend to have a higher incidence of severity for low height to age, even moderate to severe malnutrition from that chart. So what we need to do is make sure that we provide nutrition for these children to be healthier. Okay. Our next chart, figure 12-6, is looking at children from proper households have much higher rates of stunting in children in the same country live in richer households, poorer households. So what we're seeing on this chart is that people that are poor aren't getting the same nutrition as people that are rich, which in most instances is common sense. If you're rich, you can go buy better foods, better groceries, and actually buy groceries. If you're poor, you can't afford to do that. I was watching a documentary several years ago where there was kids in South America who were actually going through garbage dumps and reclaiming food that was tossed out from richer households so they could take food home and eat that. Again, that food was spoiled, and that was the only source of calories because nutrition wasn't being provided. Okay. Food security and food systems, this is our next slide. Okay. Now, food security exists when we have people have access to enough food, activity and productivity. Now, food security is dependent on food being physically available for these people. So a lot of times in economical countries where there's money, food is affordable and nutrition is available. In poorer countries, the food security isn't as good because food is less available, which means it's more expensive. If you don't have the money, you can't buy the food. A classic example of this is World War II Germany, post-World War II Germany, sorry. Actually, post-World War I would have been a much better example. Post-World War I Germany, because of what happened through the war, a lot of taxes were provided to Germany to compensate the other countries that Germany invaded in the war. So what ended up happening was a loaf of bread, which would have cost you, say, US equivalent 5 cents, would have cost you up to $150 for the same loaf of bread, because the available sources to make the bread weren't there, so the cost of bread went up because people became greedy and decided they could get more money for foods that would be considerably cheaper. Okay. Post-Second World War Germany, or post-Second World War, Germany was an entirely different situation because we learnt from what happened at the end of World War I, and we tried to provide resources and availability and help these countries become developed enough that they could provide nutrition for their own people. And this happened also with the other Axis countries, which would have been Italy and Japan, post-World War II, to help get back on their feet, to provide nutrition for their population, prevent the resurgence of what happened at the end of World War I, which led into World War II developing. Okay. Now the next slide discusses Global Hunger Index. Global Hunger Index is abbreviated as GHI, and that's a metric estimation of the burden from undernutrition in populations. Now this is based upon global hunger not in adults but in children only, because we tend to see that if a child is fed, the parents tend to be fed. If a child is fed, the parents tend to be fed also. So the standard that we use is the nutrition of children. How well off are the children? Because if the children are in poor health, it means that pretty much the entire population of a country is in poor health also. Okay. Now that leads us to chart figure 12-7, which is the number of daily caloric foods available for human consumption. Okay, and what we can see is that from 1990 to 2015, the amount of foods that's available to third world countries or developing countries has increased. Not dramatically in a lot of situations, but it has decreased to provide extra calories on a daily basis per person. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we have enough calories provided so a person can exist on a daily basis. Okay. The next chart, which is figure 12-8, is percentage of population with chronic food insecurity. And what we're seeing in this chart is that's decreasing. Unfortunately, it's not decreasing enough. We tend to see third world countries there is a decrease, but not as dramatic as in the developing or the second world based countries. The biggest problems that we tend to see are in countries like Africa. The chart talks about Nigeria and Ethiopia. Again, those numbers are much lower than they were back in the 1990s when there's starvation and famine, but those numbers are still much higher than they should be. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we're training people in crop rotations and crop development, harvesting, and growing more appropriate, higher calorie-based foods within these countries to help the population. And one of the things that the United States is a forerunner in is genetically altering or genetically developing these foods, which means that the foods are growing larger and have a higher caloric yield, which means you need less space to grow essentially a better crop and provide better nutrition for people. Now, what we've done in the United States is a lot of times when we shop, we go from regular grown foods to organic. Organic foods tend to take a lot more effort to grow them because we're not using fertilizers, and there's a lot more spoilage. With genetically modified foods, they're not necessarily organically grown, but they're grown to provide a better yield and a healthier crop. And by using these, they still are organic, but they're not organically grown. We tend to have a crop that's been fertilized and also been sprayed or used pesticides on to make sure that more of the yield and more of the harvest is available for consumption, which makes a healthier population. Okay. If we go to chart 12-9, we look at the Global Hunger Index, which is GHI, and we see that's improving across the globe from 1990 to 2015 when this chart was published. Okay. Again, countries that are weaker are the third world countries, India, Africa effectively, and we're seeing that there is a dramatic decrease in the amount of hunger in these countries, but the hunger is still much more prevalent than it is in the second world countries or in the first world, which is developed countries like the United States. Okay. The next chart, figures 12-10, discusses people in low-income countries spending a high share of the consumer expedition on foods. Unfortunately, what we're seeing here is that a larger percentage of money is being spent on foods in third world or developing countries than it is in the United States. Again, because food is so much more readily available in developing countries, it's cheaper. And because these third world countries don't have readily access to it, the foods become much more expensive. Okay. Now, food insecurity we tend to see in countries that have more global poverty. So if your country is poorer, there's less food security, so there's food insecurity, which means that the food isn't as readily available. So the more money you have, the more likely you have food. And if you don't have money, you're going to be starving because the food isn't readily available, or the food you can access isn't of sufficient